Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, where we have all kinds of fun conversations about agronomy and plant nutrition and human health and the ways they intersect in so many beautiful ways. Today, I've been having a wonderful visit here in person with Bob Quinn, who's a good friend of mine from Montana. I've had Bob on here in the past, and over the last several months, the conversation, actually really in the last 6 weeks, the conversation that has really been surfacing for me in ways that it hasn't for almost a decade is the conversation around nutrient density and growing medicinal quality food, growing immunotherapy quality food. You know, Dan Kittredge and I got onto this train, if you will, and probably almost 20 years ago at this point. And I became really inspired by the idea when we were on our own farm growing up. I became really inspired by the idea that we could grow plants that were so healthy that we could regenerate soil health, we could grow crops that were resistant to diseases and insects, and we could start having a legitimate conversation about food as medicine. But I discovered to my dismay after some time that this was a conversation that many farmers, they were interested in having the conversation, they were inspired by it, but for most growers, it wasn't enough to actually get them to do something different. And that's beginning to change. I've had more conversations in the last 2 months with growers who are actually measuring their nutrient density and are marketing based on that and are being paid for that across a broad cross-section in beef and dairy and pork and nuts, and the list goes on and on. I've been quite inspired. So, Bob, you're one of the people that of all those that I know, you have probably been for the longest period of time. You've been one of the pioneers here in North America of actually measuring the nutritional integrity of the crop that you are growing and talking about that and marketing about it. So what has that journey been like?
Well, John, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here in person and to spend a little time together. I told Mark earlier this morning that we could spend weeks and not get to the end of our list of topics we'd like to talk about. But the thing you're referring to with the nutrition in plants really was stimulated for me by our experience with our ancient wheat that we market under the trademark of Kamut. And it's an ancient grain that we started growing as a novelty, actually. We were told it came out of King Tut's tomb. Well, that wasn't true, but that was the story, and it was a great story, and so we just started marketing it as a novelty. And then lo and behold, one of our friends who couldn't eat modern wheat had some of this, and she could eat it. She'd done some kinesiology studies or testing to see if she could eat it, that it wouldn't make her sick, because she was really violently ill with modern wheat, and she not only could eat it, but it made her feel better. And she sent some to her sister, and her sister had all kinds of problems with all kinds of different foods. And after eating this grain in the form of pasta for about 6 weeks or so, not only could she eat it, and she couldn't eat other wheat, but she was less sensitive to some of these foods that she had been given trouble. So it's actually healing her body.
That's the amazing part. That's the piece that I get so inspired by, because I've heard dozens of stories like that. Just in the last, for some reason, there's just this culmination in the last couple of months of people telling me, this is stories from growers and farmers telling me, hey, people are eating our dairy and their gut issues are clearing up.
Yes.
They are healthier. Their immune system is responding better. And I'm hearing that from grass-fed beef producers who are producing amazing quality beef, that all of a sudden people who are consuming this beef are much healthier even than they were when they were eating a lot of, when they were on a carnivore diet on mainstream beef. There was an additional noticeable improvement with producing higher quality. That's medicinal quality. That's immunotherapy quality food. That's where we need to be.
Right. I agree totally. And then we went from those just simple observations to then sponsoring some extensive research in Italy. I couldn't find anybody. This is the late 80s. We couldn't find anybody in America. I couldn't find anybody that wanted to work with me at that time that actually believed there was any problem with modern wheat. Most of them said, well, it's probably in their head. It's people are just, having problems because they think they're having problems. In Italy, we found a different attitude, and we ended up, after about 15 years of pretty extensive research and trials, now we got into comparing modern wheat and ancient wheat in human clinical trials with people with chronic disease. And we found that it was anti-inflammatory, and we know that inflammation is connected with all chronic disease. And so we immediately went to that topic. And now we published about 36 peer-reviewed journal articles. You can find them on our website on Kamut.com and see for yourself. And the science is there. And I think it's just the tip of the iceberg, just like you're saying now. It's just not an isolated case. We're starting to see it in all kinds of foods and all kinds of production systems that really revitalize the soil, which helps revitalize the gut. It's the same. The microbiome they talk about in the gut is really no different, essentially, than the microbiome in the soil, if you want to talk about it that way.
Yeah, no different in principle, really. So the idea of anti-inflammatory grain, I remember being so inspired by this in our first conversation, because it's my understanding that most modern grains that are readily available have an inflammatory effect.
That's true. That's what we've seen in our research. It's not great, but it certainly is significant and measurable. And this is just the opposite of that. That's what makes it so unusual. And it had never been described in wheat before. Wheat is not thought of as an anti-inflammatory food because in most cases it's not.
Right. Yeah.
So that's really exciting. And it opened up a whole different world for us. So I recently I sold all my businesses and had a retirement party. And
I can guess how that went.
Yeah, it was great. I promised my wife I'd have a retirement party, so we had one.
And the next day you went back to work.
And the next day, well, no, I started a regenerative organic research education and health institute. It's a nonprofit now. So, John, a nonprofit's not really a business, is it? Because I promised my wife I'd have no more businesses, you see.
Yeah, okay.
Well, that worked to a certain extent. Anyway, this institute is focusing on, and our motto in our business plan and everything, our mission statement is healing the earth by growing food as medicine. And so that's our focus. We're trying to focus on, most commodities are focusing on yield. And that's the bottom line. That's what everybody focuses on. And we don't grow a single commodity on our farm. We only grow food on our farm. And because we're growing food, that is something that people eat. And so we're focusing on the quality of that food and growing a food that just not only fills the stomach, but heals the body and keeps you healthy. And that's what we're focusing on.
Bob, one of the questions that is in the back of my mind when I hear your story and read the research, the stuff that you've published, from my perspective, there are at least two major components, and I'm sure they're both contributing. There are two major components to why your grains have an anti-inflammatory effect and why they have these positive health attributes. Part of it is obviously the genetics. Genetics play a part, but then there's also the nutritional component. And I'm going to focus on one for just a moment that I'm really intrigued by, and that is selenium. So we know that, first of all, here in the U.S., 50% of the people alive today, both men and women, are expected to get cancer in their lifetime. That's official CDC data. And you look at that and you say, why would we accept that as being normal? But we've become to accept it as being normal. But then you go to Google Scholar and you do a search for selenium as a cancer treatment, and you can look up specific types of cancers. But I've been told on good authority from people who've done thorough homework that when you go to Google Scholar and you search for selenium on cancer, there are over 400 peer-reviewed published papers reporting remarkably positive benefits of selenium as a cancer preventative and as a cancer treatment. And you look at that and you say, okay, well, just from a geological perspective, over half of the United States is severely selenium deficient. It's not present in our food supply. And yet you are growing Kamut in a region where you have adequate selenium in the soil. Shouldn't we, as a public health service, as a public health benefit, shouldn't we make it a national priority to make sure that we have adequate selenium status in all of our food? How far would that go to mitigating our public health crisis around cancer? And so anyway, with the Kamut that you're growing this in a selenium-rich region. So how much of the anti-inflammatory effect and the medicinal value that is coming from the food you're growing is coming from genetics versus how much of it is coming from the nutrition that it's able to absorb from the soil?
That's a very good question. And, John, the truth is we really don't know the mode of action for this anti-inflammatory property that we're seeing. But that would be one of the possibilities for sure. And it would be very interesting to identify the mode of action and then make sure that you are augmenting that, or at least with other plants. I mean, so what's interesting about this ancient wheat is that when we plant it side by side with our best modern spring wheat, the selenium amounts in the modern spring wheat is about 30% or 40% less than what we have in the Kamut.
Wow.
So it's a significant amount less, and it's the same grain at the same field, the same year, the same everything, and yet it's high enough in the Kamut that if you have 3 helpings a day, you have the amount of selenium recommended by the government in their nutritional values. So just a normal diet, you can have something that's actually very important, but it has to be a diet that is made up of plants and foods and animal products and whatnot that contain these things.
Right.
And so that's the difference between, I think, what we have today and what we had 100 years ago or maybe 150 years ago, where a lot of that deficiency has come not only by the way we farm, but also by the way we have bred our plants, focusing on not that we tried to eliminate nutrition. That wasn't the goal. The goal was focusing on yield. And when you focus 100% on something, you're going to let something else go by that you don't even know that's happened until way later. And I think that's a lot of what's happened. So there's 2 things that are going on. The soil is being diminished in its nutrition, and also the plant's ability to take up what's left or act in a way that provides high nutrition is being compromised.
So that's fascinating. So I framed my original question as, what are the drivers? Is it the genetics, as in so that we have a different protein profile on the plant, or is it the mineral content? And what you're saying, actually, it is the genetics that are leading to the genetics lead or develop the capacity to absorb the minerals.
It's a potential.
Right.
So we have the potential there. Do you have a higher potential or lower potential?
Right.
So you can have better plants actually produce a pretty good result in poor soil, for example. And you can have poorer plants produce a better result in really great soil. But what if you have both of those, John, combined? What if you have the plants with the genetic also in the living soil to have the best of both worlds? And that's what we really need. Because you mentioned earlier about the cancer thing. In the future, that half the living population has cancer to look forward to. But if you look at the chronic disease levels right now, and these are again CDC reports, and everybody's starting to talk about it, it's 60% of the entire population has at least one chronic disease. 40% have 2 or more. And
wow,
that is not sustainable. That means over half our population is already sick. They're already sick. And so we have the sickest population in the world. We always are touted how we have the best food in the world, or the most food, the most.
We've got the most, but I think the best is arguable.
That's right. And because the best, they defined in price. So
Yeah,
it's the best
cheapest
price. That's right. It's the cheapest.
Have we forgotten the old adage that you get what you pay for?
I was just thinking the same thing.
Ay. So this conversation around inflammatory foods and chronic disease and inflammation, it's probably, 15 years or so ago, I first came to the realization of this, that there is this foundational baseline, that this is a bit of an oversimplification. It's not entirely accurate, but that you could broadly think about food selection and dietary choices on the basis of whether they produce inflammation or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what really intrigued me was the research by Bleu Blancourt in France, where they were testing animal products on and human health responses to animal products that had a narrow omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and they were not producing this in a grass-fed or grazing environment, but they were testing meat, as in beef, dairy, pork, eggs, and perhaps poultry meat as well. I'm not entirely certain. But they determined that when you have a narrow omega-3 to 6 ratio, which they were producing by feeding flax,
Mm.
You had an anti-inflammatory effect from consuming those animal products where the ratio was narrow, and a pro-inflammatory effect when the ratio was wide, similar to what you're describing in the contrast between Kamut and modern grains. And what was intriguing to me is that in that model, they're not actually farming significantly differently.
Yeah.
They're not obsessing over nutritional quality. They're simply looking at essential fatty acid ratios and feeding accordingly.
Yes.
How much further could we go down that road if we also paid attention to forage quality, nutritional value, and nutrient density, and on the list goes?
I know. And one of the things when we first saw this in our research, it occurred to me that how much of a value there could be in developing a inflammatory index so that you could test the foods for either their ability to create inflammation or decrease it.
Mm-hmm.
Because another factor, John, we haven't been talking about, and a lot of people don't talk about this either when they're talking about agriculture. And of course, you and I are involved in agriculture, and that's what we eat and breathe and see around us. But you can have the best soil systems, living soil in place, the best seeds in those, grow the best quality crops and everything. And then once you harvest those crops, and the farmer's done everything right, essentially, and they have the peak of nutrition, but you can take those crops and then just process the daylight out of them, or at least the nutrition out of them, and you can end up with food, they call it food, on the store shelves that are devoid of a lot of that nutrition that they left the field with. And this is another area.
Can you give me an example of that?
Well, I would say the processed cereals, for example. I mean, I had some friends from, not to drop names, but as an example, I had some friends from Europe who bought Fruit Loops for their kids because they thought they were buying fruit of some kind to feed their kids get more healthy.
Okay.
And I said, well, I really hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Fruit Loops are really not based on fruit, but they're all full of food coloring and all kinds of other things. Well, for wheat, and that's my main focus is wheat. That's what I was raised with. But we are throwing away the most valuable part of the wheat when we make white flour. So with white flour, we're already throwing away the bran, which has all full of fiber, which is good for digestion. We're throwing away the germ, which is all full of all kinds of nutritional vitamins and minerals too.
And then we're adding folic acid?
And then we try to add back what we took out. So we call that fortification or enrichment. But it's never the same.
Well, it's just something, when you just said that, it kind of struck me. Yeah, we call it enrichment, but it's actually enrichment with a compound that is toxic for most people.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and then we compound that by adding food colors that are also toxic and other additives that either extend the shelf life or create different flavors that are enticing the people, but they're actually toxic in their own way. And so we're really making ourselves sick by what we're doing.
Yeah, we are really making ourselves sick. There's been a more recent realization just in the last, half a dozen or so years, realizing that we're adding folic acid in, and because of lack of methylation ability and people's what our epigenetic expression is and whether our genes are like, many people don't have the methylation pathways open to be able to process and to handle folic acid. So folic acid is actually directly toxin. It is a direct toxin and makes people go crazy for about 60% of the population. Wow. 60% of our population cannot handle folic acid, and we add it to most of our wheat.
Oh, yeah. Doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, for someone, but not for people's health.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense for people who are making the money with the industrialization of this process. My goal in our institute and our farm and trying to change the direction of how we think about agriculture is for doctors to be able to prescribe food from the farm rather than pills from the pharmacy.
Right.
So that we have food as our medicine instead of pills for our food.
So I want to go back to the food processing conversation, because, I tend to think of, when I think about nutritional integrity and food quality, I often am thinking about mineral density and phytonutrient density. Those are the two kind of foundational parameters, and as well as microbiome integrity. Those are the three places that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And so, as you were talking about the challenges of food processing, that the farmer may have done everything right, and then a lot of that is stripped off, I was just running through a quick mental checklist. Okay, what if we create fruit juices like orange juice? Well, no, we've still got a lot of nutritional value that flows through there. What if we are creating, well, there's all types of different manufactured fruit and vegetable products that you can think of. And as I was running through the list, it seems to me, well, actually, no, there's a lot of phytonutrients that are transferred, and there's minerals that are transferred. Of course, the microbiome is seldom transferred. That's usually sterilized. But then it occurred to me that actually our body responds very differently to this processed foods, even if the mineral content and the phytonutrient content is still there. And a minute ago, before we turned the microphones on, you and I were having a conversation about the glycemic index, and I was asking about your cracked Kamut, which is kind of your roasted Kamut grains, as compared to puffed grains of other varieties. Tell me about the glycemic index. Tell us about the glycemic index variability in how Kamut is processed or how wheat is processed.
Well, that's a good question, John. You know, when we first started putting together promotional materials and trying to figure out what we could really say about this grain, I thought, well, let's look at the glycemic index, because that's a big item, particularly not just for people with diabetes, but in general. So we started testing different products that were made from the Kamut, and the idea was to compare it with modern wheat products. And guess what we found? We found there was way more difference between the type of products that we were making than there was between modern wheat and the ancient wheat. There was some difference there, but the biggest difference was what we were doing in the processing. For example, the lowest glycemic index was created from cracked wheat or cracked grain. So the cracked Kamut had an extremely low glycemic index that you would use to make hot cereal porridge.
So the equivalent of steel cut oats or something like that.
Yes, and that way low, way low. And then you started going up when you went into bread and pasta production. Pasta was next lowest, and then bread was all over. It had a huge variability. And then it became, after trying to figure out why, it became apparent in our research that the finer the flour was that was used in the bread or bun or whatever, cookie or whatever we're doing, made a huge difference, made the significant difference on the difference in the glycemic index. So the finer the flour, the higher the glycemic index, because the glycemic index is an indicator of how fast the starch is going into the blood and converted to sugar.
Exactly.
And so the finer the grind is, the quicker it goes in, because there's less to digest.
Right.
And the more coarse or complex your food is when you eat it, the slower it's going to go in. So we got to the very tip top of the testing by looking at puffed Kamut. So puffed Kamut, and I hate to even tell it's on the air, because this is not a good story. But if you have diabetes or a concern with glycemic index, I would not recommend puffed Kamut for you. And it's just like regular puffed wheat. If anybody, and we probably all had some, it melts in your mouth. So if it's melting in your mouth, John, imagine how quick it's going into your bloodstream. I mean, there's almost no digestion or breakdown needed. It's really mostly broken down, and it's going into your bloodstream very fast, and therefore a very high glycemic index. Now, the roasted stuff that you mentioned earlier, the snacks that we have are not puffed, they're roasted. So it's still pretty much intact as a whole grain. It's certainly a little bit easier. And we haven't actually done the glycemic index on that, but knowing that what the product process is, we can predict it's probably in the lower range anyway. And because what we've seen is that the more the integrity of the grain is destroyed or reduced, pulverized, you could say, the higher the glycemic index. And we saw this generally with modern wheat too.
I'm just thinking about breakfast cereals, common breakfast cereals. And there, of course, you mentioned Fruit Loops a little bit ago, but these are ultra-processed foods, which I speculate. I don't know. I could very well be mistaken with this. But do you know what the fineness of grind is of those? Because we know, first of all, they have a high carbohydrate content, a high sugar content to begin with of added sugars.
Adding, yeah, right there.
They're adding sugars. But then what you're describing is that if that flour is also being milled very fine, it's my understanding that that sugar hits your bloodstream almost as rapidly as white sugar.
That's what we saw in the glycemic index with the puffing. It was right in there with white sugar. I mean, it was right at the very top of the what do you call it? The control.
Yeah.
Which is white sugar is the control.
So there's this analog that I've heard repeated frequently is that you get the same sugar hit in your bloodstream. You get the same sugar hit from a single slice of white bread as you do from a full-size Snickers bar.
Is that right? Wow.
Yes.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised.
It's a significant sugar hit.
And that's why I was going back to what we were saying earlier about the importance of whole wheat and whole grains as far as baking with, because then you've got the whole package. When you strip away what you're refining is what you're doing. When you refine any of your foods, you're stripping away components that are probably there for an important reason and playing an important part in nutrition and digestion. And many times when you strip those away, then you need to add things that make up for that. And that even makes it worse, actually, in the end. So the best advice that I can give people is to eat as close to the field as possible, or as close to what it looked like when it came out of the field as possible.
Yeah, also low processing. Yeah, I think it's this whole conversation around glycemic index and particle size of flour and grain is quite intriguing. I want to switch gears to talk about a completely different type of process and plant source. For the last year and a half, particularly in the last 6 months during the most recent presidential political campaign, there's been all of this emphasis on seed oils, and that seed oils are the cause of all of our collective societal ills, at least relative to public health. And I look at that conversation and think to myself, this is once again a very polarizing conversation about naming something as universally bad or universally good. And there is this large spectrum that I've even seen people are trying to bring nuance to the conversation, or making some minimal effort to bring nuance to the conversation by creating these score charts of saying that, well, here's the oleic or linoleic acid profile of these various seed oils, and here's the ranking that canola is close to the top of the list of not being good for you, and the animal products are all the way here at the bottom of the list. They're the best for you. And I look at that as well, and this is, just to be clear about, this is something I have not studied a lot. It's really outside my area of expertise, but I know enough to be dangerous. I know that there is no such thing as safflower oil. You can have high linoleic, low, you have all these different types of oil profiles. The same is true of sunflower oil. The same as you have all these various seed oils that have very different fatty acid profiles. And my wife is a very gifted natural health practitioner, and I know that occasionally some of these seed oils show up as being very valuable medicinally. If it's the right oil, it's not as a primary food or major food group, but depending on what a person has going on in their body, in their system at that point in their life, some of these seed oils can be very valuable medicinally. So I'm not quite ready to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I'd like to bring some more nuance to this conversation. I think you might know a little bit about it.
Well, I'm not an expert, but remember in the old days, well, you don't remember, I don't remember, but in centuries gone by, there used to be whipping boys in schools that would take the beating for things that had gone wrong. And that's what I think about when I hear what you describe. And I see that too. I mean, oils, vegetable oils now are the new whipping boy. And every plague or every malady.
I'm happy to assign the spankings where they're needed. If some seed oils get the credit, then go for it. But let's not discount sugar. Let's not discount vaccines. Let's not discount some other things that are going on.
Absolutely. And so we have a couple of different things going on with vegetable oils. Of course, I'm also a safflower grower.
Yeah.
And so you probably knew that. But so this is a question we're having to address more and more. And what we were doing on our farm, of course, we're growing it organically without any added toxins being added. We're trying to focus on soil health, so we have good soil health too. Then we are crushing it in cold presses, and it's not refined. So again, it's like white flour. We're not refining it and taking out all the goodies that come along with the vitamins and some of the minerals that come along with the plant naturally, and maybe have a function that we don't appreciate or even know about as far as help aid with the metabolism. So our vegetable oil is yellow. It's not clear. It hasn't been refined. And one of the things in the refining process is the use of solvents to extract as much oil as possible. It's all about industrialization of our food, processing, and getting every last drop of value out of every possible source we can.
Yep.
And so what's it to do with extraction? They extract with hexane, and of course they say, well, don't worry because we get all the hexane out. Well, if you have done any chemistry, you know it's very difficult to get everything out once you put something in. And even though it may be at very, very low levels, it's still toxic. It's not good for you. And so we have something in the majority of our oil processing that's really toxic to us. We shouldn't be doing that. And we're removing something. We're stripping away things that might be good for us that we don't even know about. So we have those kind of things going on. With the high oleic safflower that we're using, we know that oleic acid is good for your heart, for example.
So let's back up. Let's dig into this a little bit deeper.
All right.
What is high oleic safflower? How is it different from? Tell us why not all safflower is the same, or how it's not all the same.
Well, it's been bred or selected to either one type of fatty acid to be in dominance over another one. So in order to be high oleic, it has to be at least 75% oleic acid, which is a monounsaturated fatty acid, which means it has only one double bond, which means that it is more stable than fatty acids with multiple double bonds. We call it polyunsaturated fatty acids, and they are less stable. So they can go into trans fats in cooking and whatnot quicker and easier than monounsaturated fatty acids. So that's one thing you have. You have what you start with, but also you have what it deteriorates into. So if you have something that doesn't deteriorate into something really bad like trans fats very fast, then you can discontinue using it before you get to that point.
But the point that I'd like to actually understand better as well is you have different types of safflower. You have high oleic safflower.
Yeah.
There's a spectrum here.
There is. And so
what's the degree of variation across the spectrum?
Oh, it's huge. And for the linoleic, the high linoleic is another one that's a polyunsaturated fatty acid, and most of that goes for bird food. And for birds, that's the preferred for their diet. So you have different types of oils and different concentration that really have different functions and different places where they function better than others. And so for birdseed, the linoleic safflower is preferred over the high oleic, for example.
Yeah. So when we talk about high oleic versus high linoleic, are those two things? I'm just visualizing a seesaw and a balance here. Are those two things mutually exclusive? Like when you have high oleic, does that mean it's necessarily low linoleic?
Yes.
And what is the degree of variability between, let's take linoleic, for example, the degree of variability between low and high? Is it 5x? Is it 10x?
Well, for high oleic, as I mentioned, it has to be at least 75%. That means that 25% can't be 25%, more than 25% of anything else. That means all the other possibilities. So linoleic is, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 maybe. But in high linoleic, it's maybe just the opposite. It might be 60, 70% linoleic.
So 4 to 5x variability, possibly.
Could be. Just flipping them.
Yeah. If I remember from our previous conversation, and maybe this wasn't on a recording, but in a personal conversation at some point, you actually attempted to grow or started to grow oil for fuel, but then discovered that it was too valuable to grow for fuel, but then still ended up using it as fuel.
Yeah. Well, so I started growing camelina, which is a very high productive oil seed in our area because you can plant it in soils that are 40 degrees. And so really early in the spring. We have trouble growing canola in our area and grow it further north because in our area it gets too hot too quick. And the blossom The blossoming function can't stand too high a heat, and so we
Doesn't
can't.
pollinate well.
No, it doesn't, and it doesn't set seed. So we don't have as good a luck with that. Safflower is more like a thistle. It loves the heat. In fact, the heat is responsible for making higher amounts of the oleic acid. So we want high heat for that. So I started out with the idea of growing my own fuel. That was my original idea with my oil press. And I went, starting with the camelina, and I went to my friends in Germany that I got the oil press from and knew about using straight vegetable oil in diesel engines. So I didn't want to make biodiesel because that has its whole new set of problems. And I wanted to be able to use it straight. And so they said, well, you can't use camelina because it's a polyunsaturated fatty acid, and it won't burn directly straight in diesel. You have to have a monounsaturated fatty acid like oleic. And so then that got us onto the safflower. And then I have a hired man. Don't you love it when you have employees that have really take initiative and think and do stuff it's so much fun. And they took some of this safflower oil to the local restaurant. And the guys at the restaurant said, man, this makes the best tasting French fries that we've ever had. We'll pay you $2 a pound for this. And so, I'm not a great mathematician, but I could do that in my head. At $2 a pound, that's about $16 a gallon.
You can't afford to burn that in a tractor.
That's right. And so I changed my whole direction from growing fuel to growing food. And then we started supplying the University of Montana in Missoula, and so quite a large amount, because they're using all of our oil now for their kitchens. And they said to me, we could save this oil and give it back to you because I told them the fuel story. And I said, we can give it back to you if you could use it that way. And I said, well, that's a great idea. Let me think about that. And so
for 2 seconds.
That's right. And because, now if a farmer can sell their crop twice, John, this is a big economic advantage, you see. And so all we had to do was dewater it. So there's a little bit of water in the oil. That the tolerance for water in diesel is 0. Yeah. So we had to dewater it. We had a little centrifuge to cook out the bigger particles, and then we passed it through 3 filters down to 10 microns. So it was clean. And we had to, because it has a higher viscosity than diesel, we had to preheat the vegetable oil before it went into the injectors. So we were able to do that with my friends in Germany who had developed a heat exchanger that ran off the engine's hot water, and we brought the temperature of the oil up to 160 degrees right before it went in the injectors. And then it went in, and you couldn't tell the difference when you switched. The engine was heated up and you switched from diesel. You had to start on diesel, get it warmed up, and then you switched it to vegetable oil. You couldn't feel any power loss. You couldn't hear any difference. You couldn't feel any difference. The only difference you could tell was the exhaust now smelled like French fries. So that's
more appealing than diesel.
That's right. So anyway, with this idea, we were able to use a oilseed crop first for food and then for fuel. It really knocks out the whole debate that goes through this country from time to time of setting aside good crop acres to grow fuel. Yeah. But why can't we, especially for diesel,
why can't we do both?
Do both. And then you don't have a disposal problem with your used oil or waste oil, they call it in that case. And the trick is now the safflower oil is much more expensive than the cheap stuff the schools are using. But guess what, John? It lasts a lot longer because it's so much more stable. It gives a better flavor. And we know that flavors are really tied to nutrition. So the better something tastes or the better aroma it has naturally, not because something's been added, but naturally, then generally that is tied to nutrition. So we know we're getting more nutrition.
So what does the net cost end up being for the university? They're paying more per pound, but does it last long enough that it ends up costing them less?
Almost the same.
Almost the same.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you do it?
What's that?
Why wouldn't you do that?
I know. And so it's a win-win-win. And, my mode and my office or way I do business has been with the idea that everybody wins. And when everybody wins, that gives you sustainability. And to me, that's my best business model. Everybody wins. And that's what's happening with this oil project.
Bob, my mind is bouncing around back and forth. And there's a question that I missed back when we were at the very beginning of our conversation. when we were talking about the anti-inflammatory benefits of Kamut. You mentioned that you approach this topic from the perspective of wanting to be able to sell it and want to be able to market to it. Are you able to make any of those claims on the label?
Well, not yet. I know I sold my snack company, and the new folks making
you supposedly retired. I remember.
Yeah, that's right, in my retirement program. And the new folks were selling our crackling Kamut snacks through Amazon, and they started labeling it as anti-inflammatory because of our research. And Amazon just took it right off the shelf and said, "You can't say that." I said, "The government's going to come down on you, and you have to go through all this procedural paperwork and everything, and have all these certain kinds of research, not just stuff you published by yourself, but." I don't even know what all the rules are because they were so discouraged they didn't even start with the process of trying to figure out how they could say that in a legitimate way. So it's a paradox to me that it's not more simple for us to be able to advertise what we know we have produced is better because of the way the industry has been created, and it's not really created to help this kind of natural nutrition stuff.
That's intriguing to me because I know I'm not surprised by that. I know of a dairy that has phytonutrient content in their milk that is measured and known to be multiple. It's multiples higher phytonutrient content and a narrow omega-3 to 6 fatty acid ratio. And I'm not aware that they've done the studies, but I'm sure if they did, they would also find a similar anti-inflammatory effect. The same of grass-fed beef being turned into meat sticks. I know of several remarkable quality resources, but if we can't put that on the label and if we can't say that, then how do we communicate our value to the consumer?
This is a big question. And if the consumer doesn't know the higher value, why would they pay more?
Right.
And if they don't pay more, why would the farmer go through the effort to make it a higher value in nutrition if they're not going to get paid more? Because most of the farmers, at least in our area, they're right up against the wall financially, and they can't afford to do much experimentation, or much less do something that they're not going to get paid for. So the whole thing really starts with the label, so that you inform the buyer of what the value is of what they have to choose from. And if they see that there's more value, twice as much value in something that costs 30% more, why wouldn't they buy it? And that would start to drive the whole process, I think, much quicker and much better than the regulatory method, which is quite cumbersome, quite confusing, and quite politically charged.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts that come into my mind. They're not particularly related to each other. One of them is related to price, and one of them is related to labeling. So I'll start with the labeling conversation first, and that is, one of the people have been suggesting and proposing for the better part of 2 decades that in our work at AEA, we should start our own verification standard. And the idea, I understood the attractiveness of the idea, but it was never particularly a priority because we always had 1,001 other things that were bigger priorities, it seemed like. But now in the last, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, well, maybe it's whatever it is, recently we launched Integrity Grown. And the Integrity Grown verification is a sticker that goes on a label, an icon that goes on a label that verifies 2 things. One is it verifies the absence of toxins, not just as pesticides, but also molds and mycotoxins, etc. But secondly, it also verifies the presence of quality. And we know that quality is different for different crops. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about this, well, my goodness, we need an icon. We needed a logo that is to food what the UL icon is to industry, something that is a verification of quality. And I'm quite intrigued to see where the Integrity Grown verification goes because it is designed for this specific outcome. And it remains to be seen how the future evolves. Is Integrity Grown still the incumbent? Is it the only player or the biggest player in the space in 10 or 15 years from now? I don't know how that'll play out. But you know what we will do? We will move everyone's cheese. We will change the landscape
That's
as a
important.
result of that label in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
That's the vision. And we might end up being the incumbent. That'll be exciting too.
Sure. Why not?
Yeah.
I mean, somebody has to lead out. And I see it as a vacuum
Yeah.
in many cases. I mean, we have so many labels now, but very few really focus on nutrition.
Right.
And which should be there's all kinds of reasons to buy a certain brand over another one. But in my mind, the health of your family should be right. If people understood it, would be right up there at the top.
Yeah.
The top for sure.
You know, speaking of this, this brings me to the conversation on price and value. The comment that you just made. Blake Alexander has made this comment to me enough times that it really stuck in my head. Consumers deserve to be able to pay more for quality.
I love that. I love that. And that's really true. That's what we should be heading for. I mean, we've been focused on cheap and abundant for so long that we see the unraveling of our own health fabric in our nation and all kinds of other problems that have come with that. And so the bragging rights to that, to me, are quite limited, and especially going in the future. And what you're talking about has to be the future. We can't continue going in the direction we are now. There's no future. But the future you're talking about really focuses on quality and how we can assess it, and how we can increase its availability.
You know, I think Blake's comment, his quote, has struck so deeply for me because historically in agriculture, well, I say historically, at least in the last couple of decades that I'm most familiar with, we've tended to really undervalue ourselves. We have a hard time charging for what our product is worth because we're constantly being told by the marketplace and everyone around us that it's not worth very much, that we're not worth very much, that our work isn't worth very much, et cetera, et cetera. And Blake has shared this story. You know, I think his perspective and his opinion is one worth hearing because while they would not take much credit for it, they would give the credit and the honor to God for the successful brand that they've established. But they have built a retail dairy brand in the last 6 years that is on track to be the third in terms of volume, the third sales volume organic dairy brand in North America behind Organic Valley and Horizon. And part of that approach has been to, as I understand it, and I should perhaps get Blake to clarify this at some point, but part of that approach has been to deliberately have the most expensive product on the shelf. Because many people desire to do the right thing, but they don't have the time, the bandwidth, or the desire to stand in the grocery store aisle and read labels extensively.
Sure.
And so if you were making a rapid pass through the dairy aisle, and you don't have time to really do your research, but you want to make sure that you get something that's high quality, what do? You buy the most expensive thing on the shelf and you keep right on moving.
Yeah.
And then you take that product home, you have an awesome experience with it.
That's what I was going to say. That is the key to the second purchase.
Yes.
So the key to the first purchase is just what you said. In many cases, if people say, oh, they just assume it's going to be better. But if it doesn't turn out to be better.
But then it has to be better.
It has to be better or they won't buy it again.
Right.
And so then you've defeated your purpose. So that really takes out the charlatans, the ones that say, oh, I'm just going to raise my price to make it more sellable. Right. Well, that'll sell the first box maybe, but it won't sell the second box. Right. And I think that the loyalty in the long run is the driver. And that's what should be the reward for people doing the right thing, like Blake's doing, what you're just talking about.
Yep. So, Bob, I want to be conscious of time, but as we wrap up this conversation, when you look at the macro landscape of what is happening across all of agriculture, or even in your region, what are the new things that you're seeing emerge that you're excited about for the future?
I think one thing, that's a really good question. There's lots of ways to answer that, but one of the things that I'm excited about is something that came out of the COVID pandemic, and that was almost everyone in this country saw an empty store shelf, and they had never seen that before in any of the lives that they're living now. And because of that, the idea of having or thinking about a regional food supply even though it might cost a little bit more, doesn't seem so strange and stupid and crazy anymore. And there's a lot more interest now in local production. And that, I think, is a big positive thing. If we can think of local food production as a food security issue or a national security issue, maybe it would sell a little bit better in Washington or easier to the policymakers. But you can have so many things.
I'm not aware that we even have a food security policy in
probably not. I'm just making that up.
Because we have an unwritten one.
Yeah, I mean, it's
called cheap food.
Yeah, well, that is. That was a goal after World War II,
right?
That we would
chicken
have
in every pot.
Cheap, yes, and abundant. So it's cheap and abundant. And actually, we made that goal, and everybody is congratulating themselves every which way forever and ever because we made that goal. But that goal came at such a high price. There's such a high price that we're paying for cheap food that now people are starting to think about that, and it's not what you pay at the checkout counter that counts. It's all the externalities, what you pay at the doctor's office months down the road.
What you pay in lack of productivity and lack of a healthy life.
This is it. And so people are starting to connect those. So the other thing I'm excited about is the more that people are starting to connect the dots with the high cost of cheap food in all that's happening that we've talked about.
I read back to the history. There was a major freeze in 1949. Prior to that freeze, it's been so long since I've read this, I'm now fuzzy on the numbers. But if I remember correctly, prior to that freeze, the state of Iowa was 6th in the nation in apple production. Today, there is no significant apple production in the state of Iowa. Iowa at that moment, I'm picking on the Iowa at the moment because anything that's not corn and soybeans is considered a specialty crop in the state at the moment. Alfalfa is a specialty crop in the state of Iowa. But it was a major flax producing state. It was a major potato producing region. It's been a while since I looked at the statistics and put the numbers together, but our heartland used to be a major producer of food crops. And today it's a major producer of fuel.
Mm-hmm. And for export and for going somewhere else.
Yep, food and grains for livestock consumption, not really for food production.
A lot of these.
And yet, this is some of the richest soil on the face of the planet. And we're using it to grow things that in the greater scheme of things don't really matter all that much from a human health perspective.
The other thing that we see in Montana, there's a big campaign now that it's called 33 by 33, and the goal is to have 33% of our plates in Montana filled with Montana-grown food. Right now, it's about 3.
Wow.
And before World War II, it was about 85 or more. And so that is also another problem, that it's not just that we are industrialized everything and everything goes out for export. We're just an export state, and it's become a completely extractive economy where everything is extracted out of rural Montana, and rural America is the same thing, what you're talking about too. Why can't we go back to feeding ourselves regionally first? And then there's still plenty that we can export.
So tell us a little bit about, this is a state-level initiative?
Yes. Yeah, it's a group that's called Arrow that has been involved with first alternative energy and then alternative agriculture. They're big supporters of the organic movement in Montana, and now they're really focusing on local and not only local but healthy food production. And so that's what the area we're trying to raise the level of interest in and get people to support local food production. So at our little farm, so we do dryland potatoes. So no one thinks about growing vegetables in Montana because we have 12 inches of rainfall, but it can be done. All you have to do is spread the plants apart a little further. So you guys here in Ohio have 3 times more rain than we have. So you can grow plants 3 times closer together than we can.
Yeah.
But we can still grow those same plants if we spread them out. So my potatoes are planted 3 feet apart. Or they have 9 square feet for each potato. Mm-hmm. So they're in rows 3 feet apart, 3 feet apart between the plants in a row. In normally, you plant them less than a foot apart, right, in rows 3 feet apart, maybe for cultivation and whatnot. So per acre, we're only able to grow 1/3 of the crop.
But per rainfall, it's exactly the same.
Yeah, but per plant, it's about the same.
Mm-hmm.
So our land is worth way less than yours here. So we can afford to grow something like that we can actually gives us more money than grain and wheat, and it provides a source of food for our local markets. And then you don't have the transportation going back and forth to California or wherever things are coming and going from. And if you want something more to worry about, look at California being the breadbasket of America and wondering where their water is going to be coming from. And who's going to grow the food if they don't grow it for us all? I think every region of the country should start getting back into the habit of providing their own food for their own region.
Well, again, from a national food security perspective, when you consider the exposure of having, I'm not sure what the number is right now, but 94% or in the 90% of all the apple production being in the state of Washington.
Yeah, this is the same.
And salad greens production being in California,
Yes.
Strawberry production being in California, or increasingly in Mexico. We have a lot of regional consolidation, which has happened because of reasons of market efficiency, growing efficiency, climate advantages, and so forth. But as the climate becomes more variable, those advantages are rapidly losing their attractiveness, or maybe not losing their attractiveness, but they no longer have the same degree of advantage as they did historically.
Well, I think they're more risky. They become more risky with it. I don't call it climate change. I call it climate chaos because that's what I see. But the more chaotic the climate is, the more risk you have, especially of growing all the same kind of crops. So at our farm, we have 9 different crops growing. Some are for the soil and some are for sale. But they all have different risk levels that they are susceptible to hail or violent storms at different degrees at different growing times. So if you have something come through, it's very rarely going to destroy everything.
Yeah.
But it will destroy something. And if that something is all you have planted, you've lost your whole crop for your whole farm that year.
Yep.
That's what I'm talking about, is mediating risk.
Yep. So, Bob, you are now pretending to be retired, and you're running a nonprofit called the Quinn Institute. How can people support you and help you in your work?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. We have a website called quinninstitute.org. And if you go to that, it not only tells you about what our goals are and what we're trying to do, but one of the buttons is for donations, and there's a donation page on that. And that tells you at what levels, at any level is welcome, of course, but we're looking now to start building a campus, and so will take a very substantial donation, but smaller donations can help with our research projects. We got lots of research projects and staff to hire to help with that.
And for all of our listeners, Bob Quinn is one of those quintessential farmers who knows how to make $1 do the work of 10. So if you want to contribute to philanthropic projects that are particularly effective, here's one you don't want to miss out.
Well, thank you very much. And we have a field day every year that not only the donors, but anyone's welcome to come and be a part of and see what we're doing firsthand. And we're always open to suggestions to fill needs that are unmet into the future.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of your work and for being willing to share your wisdom and experience.
Thanks, John, for having me.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you.